Welcome back, dear listener, to the world asleep. As the sun sets over the distant hills, the frontier hums with an ancient promise, its spirit of adventure, exploration, and untold stories woven deep into the fabric of America. Tonight, we journey through the forgotten trails that shaped a nation, the hidden paths that cradled dreams, and the silent witnesses of a land that once seemed endless. Each step we take echoes through time, across the wide, unbroken plains, beneath towering mountains, and along rivers that carried secrets to those brave enough to follow their currents. The frontier was not just a place. It was a call to all who dared to seek something greater than themselves. It was a land where hope and hardship danced in quiet harmony, where men and women left their homes, their families, and their histories behind in search of a world untouched. But the true spirit of the frontier lies not in the conquests or the gold rushes, but in the quiet moments when time stood still, when the wind whispered ancient secrets through the trees, and when the land itself seemed to remember. Tonight, we walk these roads in the stillness of the past, feeling the weight of every footstep that once echoed across these lands. The frontier remains in the bones of the earth, in the stories of those who came before us, in the mountains and rivers that witnessed their trials. We move forward with reverence, knowing that with every story we add a note to the melody of a world that was, and still is, waiting to be remembered. If the quiet winds of time find their way to your heart, let them guide you deeper into the forgotten world ahead. For in the silence of these paths, you may find the echoes of your own dreams, the whispers of your own adventure, still calling in the distance. Chapter 1. The Call of the Horizon. The frontier was not merely a destination. It was a call, a pull that tugged at the hearts of those who dared to leave the world they knew behind. To wander beyond the boundaries of the familiar and into the vast, uncharted lands that lay to the west was not simply an act of exploration, but a profound invitation, a promise that the horizon held something more than the life they had known. It was a promise whispered by the land itself, a quiet beckoning that spoke to the brave, the weary, and the dreamers alike. For the first pioneers, the call was a murmur in the distance, one that grew louder with every step they took toward it. The edge of the known world grew closer with each mile, the scent of adventure mingling with the dust of their long journeys. And as they looked out at the horizon, the endless expanse of sky and earth, there was something in the air, something electric, something intangible that made them believe that beyond the reach of the familiar, beyond the mountains and rivers that mark the limits of their world, there lay something extraordinary. These early travellers were not simply explorers in the traditional sense. They were visionaries, though they may not have known it. They did not seek fame, fortune, or glory. Instead, they sought the unknown, a world that had yet to be fully written, a world whose pages were blank, waiting to be filled with the stories of those bold enough to claim it. They sought not just land, but the promise of a new life, one that was untouched by the restraints of civilization, where a man or woman could carve out a place for themselves, where the land would not merely belong to them, but where they could belong to the land in ways that felt impossible in the society they left behind. It was the call of freedom, of possibility, and perhaps of destiny. This was not simply a migration. It was a pilgrimage to something deeper, something that could not be seen with the eyes alone but could only be felt in the heart. For those who answered this call, the frontier was not just an opportunity. It was a new beginning, one that required leaving behind everything they had ever known. Homes, families, familiar faces, they were all left behind as the land before them became the place where they would stake their futures. The first steps taken into the frontier were filled with the hope of new beginnings. They journeyed across the plains, their hearts filled with the excitement of what lay ahead. But this was no simple task. The road to the frontier was a harsh one, demanding resilience, patience, and a deep, almost reverent respect for the land that would either welcome them or reject them. For every mile travelled, there was a challenge. Rivers that had to be crossed, mountains that had to be climbed, and forests that seemed to stretch on forever. The wilderness did not make it easy to settle, but for those who answered its call, the challenges were part of the promise, the test of whether they could truly make a home in a place that seemed indifferent, yet somehow alive with potential. The land before them was vast, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. In every direction there was space for new settlements, new opportunities, new lives to be forged. The horizon was not just a line on the map, it was an idea, a dream that would unfold like the landscape itself. It was a symbol of both freedom and peril, an unspoken invitation to those who dared to believe that something more awaited them than the life they had left behind. But for all its beauty, the frontier was not a gentle land. It was a place that both promised and demanded. The mountains that rose before them were towering, majestic, and foreboding, their peaks crowned with snow even in the warmth of summer. The rivers that cut through the land were both a lifeline and a barrier, flowing with the power to carry away everything in their path. The forests, thick and dark, seemed to hide secrets, their shadows deep and impenetrable. Every element of the frontier held both beauty and danger in equal measure, and for those who dared to move forward, there was no guarantee of success. Yet the call to the frontier was not easily ignored. It was not just a call to the mind, but to the soul. The promise of something new, something untouched, was a powerful force. It drew people from all walks of life, each one answering the call for their own reasons. Some sought wealth, hoping to strike it rich in the gold mines or find fertile land where crops would grow in abundance. Others sought freedom, believing that the frontier offered an escape from the rules and expectations of society, where they could live without the constraints that had been placed upon them. Still, others sought something more abstract, the chance to be part of something bigger than themselves, to carve out a new life and a new identity in a land where history had not yet been written. The frontier was a place of reinvention, where each traveller had the opportunity to reshape their life, to become something they had never been before. And in this way, the land held not just the promise of physical territory, but the promise of self-discovery. Each step forward, each mile travelled, was a step away from the life they had known and a step toward something new, something unknown. But with each step, the land began to show its true nature. It was not a welcoming land, at least not in the way they had imagined. The frontier was wild, untamed, and unforgiving. It didn't bend to the will of those who sought to claim it. It demanded respect, patience, and sometimes sacrifice. It would not be tamed by ambition alone. The settlers would have to earn their place in the wilderness, a place where survival was not guaranteed, and where the very elements of nature could become both ally and adversary in the same breath. The frontier was a place of contradictions, a place where dreams and danger coexisted, where hope and hardship walked hand in hand. It was a land of endless possibility, but also a land where only the most determined would survive. Yet, despite all the challenges, the call to the frontier remained irresistible. It was a call that could not be ignored, a call that promised something more than what the world they had left behind could offer. As the first explorers pushed into the vast unknown, the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly before them, both beckoning and daunting. Every step forward was a step into the unknown, into a world that no one had ever fully understood. But in that uncertainty, there was a beauty, a purity, a sense that anything was possible, and that the land was both a canvas and a stage for a new chapter of history to be written. And beyond the horizon, another trail waits to be discovered, one where the world is drawn deeper into the wild. The wilderness would test them, shape them, and in some cases break them. But for those who could survive it, the frontier would offer something far greater than land. It would offer the chance to become part of a myth, part of a story that would live on long after the frontier had disappeared. This was not just a journey through the land, it was a journey through time itself, a journey toward a new beginning, toward the heart of the nation that would one day rise from these wild and untamed lands. Chapter 2: The Rivers That Carved the Land. The rivers, those winding lifelines of the frontier, were much more than mere bodies of water. They were pathways, boundaries, and symbols of both promise and peril. From the mighty Missouri to the flowing Mississippi, these rivers carved their way through the land, shaping not only the geography but the very course of the nation's expansion. They carried settlers westward, like veins pulsing through the earth, and in their currents flowed the hopes and dreams of those who dared to follow. To understand the frontier, we must first understand the rivers. They were not mere obstacles to be crossed, but the very lifeblood of the land. Without the rivers, the West would have remained a distant, inaccessible place, untouched by the hands of civilization. These rivers, however, carried the settlers and explorers into the heart of the wilderness, serving as both guide and guardian. From the moment the first explorers set their eyes on the great river systems, they understood that these waterways would be their gateway to the unknown. The rivers offered more than just a means of transport. They were a promise of survival in a land that could be unforgiving, a lifeline in a place where land alone would not suffice. The rivers brought with them resources: fish, water, fertile soil, and, most importantly, the ability to reach deeper into the heart of the frontier. The Missouri River, winding its way from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi, became one of the most important routes for early explorers and settlers. It was the first major waterway to cut through the vast heart of the continent, and it offered both opportunity and danger. For the early pioneers, the river was a way in, but also a challenge. The powerful currents, unpredictable floods, and treacherous banks posed constant threats to those who relied on them for navigation. Yet, even with these dangers, the Missouri served as a thread that connected the east to the west, allowing settlers to move deeper into the land that was still largely unknown. As we follow this river, the landscape shifts before us. The towering mountains give way to rolling plains, and the air grows thick with the scent of wild grasses and fresh earth. The river moves like a quiet giant, bending and twisting through the land, its surface glistening under the sun's soft gaze. The rhythm of the water is both calming and hypnotic, its flow carrying with it stories of those who had travelled before. The river holds secrets, untold tales of hardship, of survival, of the pioneers who watched it carry away everything they had, or who fought its currents for a place to settle. Further to the east, the mighty Mississippi, the river that carved the land into the heart of the South, became a symbol of the frontier's potential and power. The Mississippi was not just a river, it was an entire ecosystem. Its waters stretched across a vast network, feeding the lands that surrounded it and offering a path to both trade and new beginnings. As settlers moved westward, the Mississippi guided them along the southern edge of the frontier, carrying them into the growing nation. The sound of the river's gentle lapping against the shore is soothing, almost like a heartbeat, a constant rhythmic pulse that ties the land together. In this stillness, it is easy to imagine the early settlers sitting beside the river, watching the water flow by, feeling the weight of the land around them and the future that lay ahead. But there is more to the river than serenity. Beneath its calm surface lies the potential for destruction. floods could come without warning, washing away everything in their path. And yet, the river always returned to its steady flow, as if it too had learned the rhythm of survival. But the rivers were not just pathways for settlers. They were also the site of conflict. The frontier was not a land simply waiting to be claimed. It was a place where multiple cultures collided, and the rivers were where these cultures met. The native peoples, who had lived along these rivers for generations, understood them in ways the settlers could not. For them, the rivers were not just highways to the west, but sacred, life-giving forces that held meaning far beyond their role as mere transportation routes. As settlers pushed westward, they often found themselves in conflict with the native tribes whose lives had been intertwined with the rivers for centuries. The rivers, which had once been the lifeblood of the land, now became the dividing lines between cultures, lines that separated the native peoples from the newcomers, lines that carried the weight of history, tension, and bloodshed. The Mississippi River, in particular, became the site of fierce battles for control. It was more than just a river. It was a symbol of power and opportunity. Those who controlled the Mississippi controlled the flow of goods, resources, and people. And as the settlers moved westward, they were not just moving into new territories, they were pushing against the established rhythms of life that the native tribes had lived by for centuries. Yet, amid this tension, there was also a shared understanding of the river's importance. Both the settlers and the indigenous peoples knew that the river was a force to be reckoned with. Its currents were neither forgiving nor merciful, and those who sought to control it, whether through trade, conflict, or settlement, would learn to respect its power. As we move along the river's course, the landscape shifts again. The plains give way to dense forests, and the sound of the water changes. The river becomes deeper, more expansive, its flow carrying with it the whispers of those who lived and died along its banks. The trees that line the shores seem to watch, their branches swaying in the wind as if they too remember the stories of the past. The Mississippi, like all rivers, holds the weight of history within its waters. It carries the names of those who once relied on it and whose lives were shaped by its currents. But the river does not judge. It simply moves forward, its flow unbroken by the passage of time. It is a constant in a world that is anything but, a reminder that the land, the people, and the stories are all bound together by the same thread. As the river continues to wind through the land, we are reminded that the frontier was not just a place to settle, it was a place to adapt, to survive, and to learn. The rivers, like the land itself, demanded respect, patience, and resilience. They offered opportunities, but they also tested those who dared to claim them. For every success, there were failures. For every new settlement, there were communities lost to floods, to famine, to disease. And yet, through it all, the river remained. It was a witness to everything, the triumphs, the tragedies, the lives lived and lost. And as the river turns, so too does our journey, toward the heart of a land where only the most steadfast remained. The rivers may have guided the settlers, but the land that lay beyond them would demand more than just their strength. It would demand their soul. The rivers, with their endless flow, were only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold in the wilderness, where survival was not guaranteed, and where the true test of the frontier lay in the hearts of those who dared to push deeper into the unknown. As we leave the river behind, the landscape ahead becomes more challenging. The horizon grows distant once again, and the unknown stretches before us. The rivers may have carved the path, but now it is time to face the mountains, to traverse the plains, and to discover what lies in the heart of the wilderness, where only those who endure will survive. Chapter 3: The Silent Footsteps of the Native Pathways. Before the first settlers left the east in search of the vast open land that lay beyond the mountains, the American frontier was already a home to many. The land, so often portrayed as a blank canvas ready for civilization, was actually a landscape woven with the histories, cultures, and paths of its indigenous peoples. These paths, worn into the earth over generations, carried with them the stories of those who had lived and continue to live in close harmony with the land. Long before the rivers and mountains became barriers and obstacles to newcomers, they were the lifeblood of a rich, diverse set of communities whose understanding of the land was deep and profound. We walk now in the silent footsteps of those who came before. The landscape we know as the American frontier was theirs long before the first European settlers saw it with wide, searching eyes. Their lives were in tune with the land, their movements across it shaped by a different rhythm, a rhythm of respect, of understanding, and of an unspoken bond that linked the people to the earth. They knew the land as one knows a body, its every curve, its every crevice, its hidden secrets. The trails they walked were not just pathways from one place to another. They were arteries, veins, connecting every part of the land, holding together a web of cultures that, though different in language, belief, and custom, were united by a shared reverence for the earth. The Native American pathways were not the product of mapmakers or pioneers. These paths were the result of centuries of movement and survival, of rituals and migrations. They moved in ways that aligned with the seasons, following the herds, the crops, and the changes in the sky. They carved through dense forests, crossed wide plains, climbed mountains that seemed to touch the heavens, and forded rivers that rolled like giants through the land. Their journeys were sacred, their steps deliberate, and their stories were inscribed in the very soil they walked on. We find ourselves on one of these ancient trails now, walking softly through the undergrowth, the world around us quiet but alive. The forest hums with the pulse of life, the leaves rustle like whispers of the past. The scent of earth and pine fills the air, grounding us in the present but connecting us to something much older. The path before us is not wide, but it is clear, the earth packed firmly beneath our feet. The trail is worn, but not by modern boots. It is shaped by the careful steps of those who knew it intimately. Every rock, every tree, every bend in the trail speaks of journeys made by those who understood the land not as something to conquer, but as something to respect. As we walk deeper into the forest, we feel the presence of the land's original inhabitants. Their footprints, invisible to the eye but palpable to the spirit, press gently into the earth. The landscape before us is not a blank slate, but a living testament to those who have shaped it. The trees that tower above us, the rocks that dot the hillside, the streams that trickle gently through the underbrush, all of these things are part of a larger story. It is a story of survival, of wisdom passed down through generations, of a deep, enduring connection to the land that stretches far beyond the fleeting human lifetimes that have come and gone. These ancient pathways were not just for travel, they were spiritual. They were sacred routes that led to places of reverence, sacred sites, mountains where the spirits dwelled, rivers that carried the memories of ancestors. The journeys along these paths were often more than just physical. They were metaphysical, journeys of the soul. The land was not simply something to be walked upon. It was a living entity to be revered, a partner in the dance of life. Every tree, every animal, every gust of wind carried meaning, and the paths that the indigenous peoples followed were aligned with the rhythms of the earth itself. The Native American understanding of the land was not a view of ownership, as it would come to be seen by the settlers. It was an understanding of stewardship, of balance, of living in harmony with the natural world. The earth was seen as a relative, a living being with whom humans shared a sacred bond. It was not something to be owned, but something to be cared for and respected. a concept that would soon clash with the ways of the settlers who viewed the land as something to be claimed and controlled. As the settlers moved westward, they would walk over these old trails, but they would not walk them with the same reverence. They would leave footprints, but they would also leave scars, altering the landscape in ways the original inhabitants could never have imagined. And yet, the old paths would not be entirely lost. The land, despite the changes wrought by time and conflict, has a way of holding on to its past. The footsteps of the indigenous peoples are still there, etched into the soil, remembered in the names of the rivers, the hills, and the mountains. And as we walk these trails now, we're walking through the memory of a people whose lives were entwined with this land, whose stories still echo in the wind. As we continue along the path, the landscape begins to change. The trees thin out, the ground becomes rougher, and the air carries a hint of cold. The journey grows more difficult, more demanding. The trail winds upward, climbing toward a ridge where the land opens up to reveal a vast expanse, a landscape that stretches for miles in every direction. The horizon seems endless, as if the land before us holds the entire future within it. But there is a quiet undercurrent of tension in the air. We are not the first to walk this land, nor will we be the last. The paths that have led us to this point are not just trails of movement, they are the paths of conflict, of struggle. As the settlers began to push westward, these peaceful trails would become the sites of battles between those who understood the land and those who sought to reshape it. The indigenous peoples would fight to hold on to their way of life, to preserve their connection to the land, but they would be met with overwhelming force. And the paths, once sacred, would become pathways of resistance, of survival, of loss. The land, however, would not forget. It would remember the footsteps that had walked it long before the settlers arrived. The trees that had whispered stories of the past would continue to whisper those stories, even as new voices began to echo through the wilderness. The paths may have changed, the people may have moved on, but the land itself remains, holding the memory of all those who came before. As we stand on this ridge, looking out over the land below, we feel the weight of history pressing down upon us. The land is vast, but it is also fragile, shaped by the hands of those who have walked upon it. The footprints of the past are not just memories, they are alive in the earth, in the air, in the trees that sway in the wind. And as we look toward the horizon, we understand that this journey is not just one of exploration. It is a journey of connection, of understanding, of remembering. The land before us, both beautiful and brutal, holds the stories of those who lived upon it long before we arrived. And though we may walk these paths with our own intentions, with our own goals, we must remember that we are not the first to have walked them. The footsteps of those who came before still echo in the soil beneath our feet. And if we listen closely, we can still hear their voices, whispering through the wind, through the trees, through the very fabric of the land itself. Yet, as we move forward, the story begins to shift. The world that once was, the world of harmony between the people and the land, begins to fade. The footsteps we follow will soon be overshadowed by the weight of the coming storm, the storm of conflict, of expansion, and of change that will shape the future of this land forever. But for now, we move quietly, respectfully, along the old paths, feeling the rhythm of the earth beneath our feet. As we walk deeper into the wilderness, the landscape stretches out before us, both beautiful and unforgiving. The world is quiet, but beneath that silence something stirs, a sense of anticipation, a sense of what is to come. The land is waiting, just as the settlers would soon arrive, bringing with them the promise of change. And the old paths, once so familiar, will be forever altered by the footsteps of those who follow. We leave these trails behind, and as the forest gives way to open plains, we sense the shift in the air. The wild, untamed land before us holds both promise and danger, and as the sun begins to set over the horizon, we prepare ourselves for the journey ahead, the journey into the heart of a land that will soon be transformed. Chapter 4: The Great Migration of the Dust. Through the dust and the heat, the West became a place where dreams were either realised or swept away in the winds of ambition. The Great Migration to the frontier was not simply a physical journey. It was a movement of souls, a crossing of worlds, a restless tide of humanity, propelled by promises of land, opportunity, and a new life. The pioneers who set out toward the West did so with hope in their hearts and the weight of their pasts on their shoulders. They carried with them not just their belongings, but the dream of a new beginning, one that lay in the vast, uncharted lands of the frontier. The call to move westward began to grow louder as the years passed. The land that had once been a distant promise was now within reach. The United States, a young nation struggling to define itself, saw the West as a place of both possibility and destiny. It was a land where people could remake themselves, free from the constraints of old-world tradition, and claim their piece of the earth for the future. But as the Great Migration began, the land was no longer an untouched wilderness. It had become a battleground for survival, a place where hopes and dreams were tested, sometimes shattered, by the very forces of nature that had once seemed so inviting. This journey, the Great Migration, was not for the faint of heart. It demanded everything from those who answered its call. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and countless other pathways led settlers westward, their wagons drawn by oxen or horses, creaking under the weight of their lives. The journey was long, over 2,000 miles for some, and filled with uncertainty. The promise of fertile soil, of a fresh start, was enticing, but the reality of the journey was much harsher than most had imagined. The land ahead was unfamiliar, its dangers hidden beneath the surface. The pioneers faced rivers that had to be forded, mountains that had to be crossed, and deserts that seemed to stretch on forever. The weather, too, played a cruel role in the migration. In the spring and summer months, the heat would turn the earth into a dry, cracked expanse, and the dust would rise like a fog, choking the air and settling in the lungs of those who ventured through it. In the winter, snow would fall in heavy blankets, turning the mountains into impassable barriers and freezing the bodies of those caught in the storm's grip. Yet, despite all these challenges, the migration continued. It was a movement driven not just by the promise of land, but by the deep human desire for something more. The settlers, farmers, families, and dreamers pushed forward, taking risks, testing their endurance, and fighting not just against the harshness of nature, but against their own limitations. Every mile travelled was a triumph, a victory of will and determination. For many, the hardships of the journey were as much a part of the experience as the promise of a new beginning. There was no certainty, no guarantee of success, but there was a chance, and for many, that was enough. The wagon trains stretching in long, slow lines across the plains became the defining image of this great migration. They moved like a river of humanity, winding through the land with each wagon carrying not just possessions, but the hopes of a better life. The travellers moved together, sharing resources, helping each other through the challenges of the journey, and forging bonds of solidarity that would last beyond the migration itself. They were a community, bound by a common purpose, though each person's purpose was different. Some sought land, others sought opportunity, while a few simply sought escape from the lives they had left behind. The river of humanity that moved westward was not without its casualties. Along the way, many lost their lives to disease, accidents, and the unforgiving land itself. Children were lost. To the harsh conditions, families were torn apart by tragedy, and the trail became a burial ground for those who could not continue. The journey was not just a physical trial, but an emotional one. For every wagon that moved forward, there were many that were abandoned, left behind in the dust. Some had turned back, defeated by the land and its trials, while others simply never reached their destination. Yet, despite the loss, the migration continued. The dream of the West, though hard won, still called out, a siren song that could not be silenced. As the pioneers moved westward, they were not just moving into new lands, they were moving into history. Their presence, their struggles, and their triumphs would become the foundation of what would one day be called the American West. The land they settled on would be transformed, tamed, and reshaped by the people who came to claim it. But the process of transformation was not easy, and it would take more than just settlers to make the West what it would become. The land itself fought back. The wide open plains, which had once seemed like an endless canvas for human imagination, became a field of conflict. Native tribes who had lived in the West for centuries were forced to confront the settlers who moved in with their wagons, their animals, and their foreign ways. The clash between these two worlds, the world of the indigenous peoples and the world of the settlers, was inevitable. The land, once a sanctuary, became a battleground, and the Great Migration would forever alter the lives of those who had lived on it long before the settlers arrived. The settlers, for their part, were unaware of the full consequences of their journey. They did not see the land as a place of sacred memory, nor did they understand the people who had lived on it for generations. For them, the West was a place of opportunity, a blank slate where they could start anew. But in their pursuit of a better life, they unknowingly destroyed the world that had once existed, erasing cultures, stories, and histories that had lived for centuries. The migration to the West was a journey of contradictions, a journey toward a new beginning, but one that came at the expense of something far older. The settlers, moving westward in search of their dreams, were not just following the rivers and trails that led to the land of their hopes. They were also leaving behind a trail of destruction. The dream of the West would come at a cost, and the pioneers would come to realize that the land they sought to tame was not as easily conquered as they had imagined. Yet, despite the hardships, despite the losses, the migration continued. The pioneers pushed on, their eyes fixed firmly on the horizon, believing that the land they sought would make all their struggles worth it. The dream of a new life in the West was more than just a dream. It was a myth, a story they told themselves to keep moving forward, to keep pressing on despite the overwhelming odds. And as they crossed the mountains and the plains, the rivers and the deserts, they became part of the myth, part of the story of the American frontier. As the dust settled, we look toward the mountain passes that loom ahead, where new challenges will arise. The dream of the West is still alive, and though the hardships of the journey have taken their toll, the spirit of those who dared to follow the call remains in the land. We're on the verge of something new, something vast, something unknown. But as the settlers discovered, the path forward is never easy, and the dream of the West is a dream that requires everything, both the best and the worst of what humanity has to offer. The journey continues. Chapter 5. The Mountain's Silent Watch. The Rockies, those towering sentinels of stone and snow, loomed as both a barrier and a beacon for the pioneers heading west. In the vast open stretches of the frontier, where the land seemed to have no end, the mountains stood like guardians, majestic, immovable, and, in many ways, untouchable. To cross them was to enter a world that had never been tamed, a world where the rules of civilization gave way to the raw forces of nature. The journey through these peaks would be the greatest trial of the settlers, and for many it would prove to be the end of the road. But for those who could endure, the mountains held the promise of something far beyond the horizon, a new life, a new beginning. As the wagons reached the base of the mountains, the settlers looked up at the towering peaks, their snow-capped summits seemingly touching the sky. The range stretched endlessly before them, a seemingly insurmountable barrier that separated the wilderness from the land they sought to claim. The path through the Rockies was treacherous, winding its way through narrow passes, over steep ridges, and through dense forests that offered little respite from the harsh elements. The mountains were not kind to those who ventured into them unprepared. The air grew thinner as they ascended, and the chill of the mountain heights seemed to seep into the bones of the travellers. The days were long, the nights colder than any they had known before, and the terrain was unforgiving. The settlers would press on step by step, inch by inch, their progress slow and grueling. The wagons groaned under the strain, the oxen pulling them through the unforgiving terrain, their hooves slipping on the loose stones of the mountain paths. The settlers too struggled, their bodies weakened by the altitude, their muscles sore from the effort of climbing higher and higher into the mountains. But despite the challenges, the settlers were driven forward by the promise of the land that lay beyond. Every step, every breath, every strained movement was an effort to reach that distant horizon, to cross the mountains and claim a piece of the wilderness as their own. The dream of the West, once distant and intangible, was now within their grasp. Yet, with each step the mountains seemed to grow more imposing, more threatening, as if warning them of the cost of their ambition. The mountains did not care for the settlers' dreams. They were ancient, timeless, and indifferent to the human struggle. In the face of such power, the settlers were humbled. Nature, it seemed, had no interest in their plans, their hopes, or their desires. It was a force that could not be bent to their will. The mountains were not merely physical barriers. They were a reminder that the frontier was not just a place to conquer, but a place to respect, a place to learn from. As the settlers climbed higher, they were forced to rely on each other more than ever before. The path became narrower, the air colder, and the terrain more rugged. The landscape was beautiful in its harshness, the snow-capped peaks rising like monuments to the forces of nature. But it was also a land that could easily destroy those who were not prepared, those who did not understand the mountain's silent power. The journey through the Rockies was a test of endurance and will. It was not enough to simply desire the land. They had to prove themselves worthy of it. Every crossing, every challenge, demanded more than the settlers had imagined. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion became constant companions. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the settlers continued. Their resolve was strengthened by the promise of what lay beyond the mountains, the fertile lands of the West, the opportunity to claim a life free from the constraints of civilization, the chance to be part of something greater than themselves. As they neared the summit, the air became frigid, the winds howling through the passes. The snow deepened, turning the once traversable path into a treacherous mire. It was a reminder that the mountains were not just a backdrop to the settlers' journey. They were the very heart of the frontier's challenge. To pass through them was to prove one's strength, both physically and mentally. For some, the mountains would remain an impenetrable wall. For others, they would become a gateway. The settlers who reached the summit felt a sense of achievement, but that feeling was tempered by the realization that the journey was far from over. The mountains had tested them, but they had yet to face the plains that lay beyond, the wide expanse that would be their new home. There was no time to rest, no time to linger in the shadow of the peaks. The land was vast, and they had only just begun to understand the challenges it presented. As they descended from the mountain passes, the land began to change. The dense forests gave way to rolling hills, the sharp crags softened into gentle slopes. The air became warmer, the weight of the journey seeming to lift with each step. And yet, there was something about the mountains that stayed with them, something in the silence of the peaks that lingered in the hearts of the settlers long after they had crossed into the valley below. The mountains had watched over them, silently guarding the land. They had borne witness to the hopes, the struggles, and the triumphs of the pioneers who had passed through them. And now, as the settlers continued their journey, the mountains would become a part of them. They would carry the memory of the peaks, their challenges, their beauty, their indifference, deep within their hearts. The mountains had been a trial, but they had also been a teacher. The settlers had learned, in the face of nature's immensity, that their dreams were fragile, and that the land they sought to claim would not bend easily to their will. They had been humbled, but they had also been shaped by the experience. As the journey continued, the settlers would encounter new landscapes, vast plains that stretched endlessly before them, rivers that offered both sustenance and danger, and forests that whispered of past lives. But the mountains would remain etched in their memory, a symbol of the frontier's power and the test it imposed on all who sought to conquer it. The mountains had watched, and they would continue to watch as the settlers moved deeper into the wilderness. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the land, the settlers paused for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had crossed the Rockies, they had endured the trials of the frontier, and they had learned that the land they sought to tame was not a simple thing. It was a living, breathing force that could not be conquered easily. But the journey was far from over, and ahead lay new challenges, new landscapes, and new opportunities. And so, with the mountains fading into the distance behind them, the settlers continued their journey, each step forward a reminder that the frontier was both a dream and a test, a land that could shape them, but only if they were willing to embrace its challenges. The mountains had been a silent watchman, and now the settlers would carry their lessons into the next chapter of their journey. The land ahead was waiting, and they would continue to move toward it, step by step, with the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. The journey, like the mountains, was vast, and its end was still far from sight. Chapter 6. The Promise and Peril of the Plains. The Great Plains, with their endless skies and sweeping grasses, were a place of both promise and peril, where survival and destruction often walked hand in hand. To the settlers, the plains were the next frontier, a land of opportunity where fertile soil awaited their ploughs and the endless horizon seemed to beckon with the promise of a new life. But beneath the allure of fertile fields and abundant harvests lay a land that could turn treacherous in the blink of an eye, where the elements and nature's unpredictability could become as unforgiving as the mountains that had come before. As the settlers crossed the Rockies, their journey did not end with the mountains. It only began anew, for the plains were a world unto themselves, vast and open, stretching as far as the eye could see. The wind, once a soft companion on the mountain slopes, now blew fierce and unrelenting, sweeping across the flat, barren landscape in violent gusts. The sun blazed down without mercy, scorching the earth beneath, while the nights grew cold, biting, and unforgiving. The Great Plains were, in many ways, a harsh paradise. On one hand, they offered the promise of a fertile and open land where crops could grow and cattle could graze. The soil was rich and fertile, the vast expanses perfect for settling and cultivating. But for all their promise, the plains also carried with them the harshest of lessons. In the winter, the winds could freeze to the bone, leaving the settlers shivering in their homes, battling the snow and ice that could come without warning. In the summer, droughts could ravage crops, and locust swarms could descend upon the fields like black clouds, eating everything in their path. The settlers who arrived on the plains found themselves not just fighting the land but also the weather. They were at the mercy of the elements, and even their best efforts could be undone in a moment. The rain would come in torrents, flooding fields and washing away crops. The soil, which had seemed so promising, could become dry and cracked during the scorching summer months. The wind could whip across the plains with such force that it felt as though the land itself was pushing back against the settlers, challenging their right to claim it as their own. But despite these harsh realities, the settlers persisted. There was something magnetic about the plains, a promise that could not be easily dismissed. The lure of open land, the opportunity to build something from the earth, to create a life from scratch, these were things that could not be ignored. And so the settlers built their homes, planted their crops, and raised their families, their lives deeply rooted in the land that stretched endlessly before them. But with the promise of the plains came the inevitable peril. The dangers were not always visible at first. The endless expanse of the land could be deceptive, and the isolation that came with living on the plains could make even the smallest problem feel insurmountable. The settlers were alone here, far from the communities they had left behind, and the vastness of the land sometimes felt like a crushing weight. They would work long hours, day after day, to build their homes, till their land, and create the life they dreamed of. But every success came at a cost, and every season brought new challenges. The threat of drought loomed large, a constant reminder that the land could be both generous and cruel. For many settlers, the arrival of the rain was a moment of relief, a sign that their crops might survive another season. But for others, the rain was too much to handle, too much to control. The rivers that had seemed so welcoming when they first arrived now became dangerous, their waters rising to flood the lowlands and wash away years of labour. And then there were the storms. The storms of the plains were legendary, sudden and violent, capable of changing the landscape in mere minutes. Thunderheads would gather on the horizon, dark and foreboding, and within moments, a deluge of rain, hail, and wind would descend upon the settlers, tearing apart anything that was not firmly anchored. The storms, like the land itself, were unpredictable, merciless, and terrifying. But even as the settlers faced the overwhelming power of nature, they were also at the mercy of forces beyond their control. The Great Plains were not just a place of natural dangers, they were also a battleground, where settlers competed not only with the land but with each other. The West was not uninhabited when the settlers arrived. It was home to numerous Native American tribes who had lived on these plains for centuries. The arrival of the settlers marked the beginning of a long and painful conflict, one that would tear apart families, cultures, and communities. The land, once shared, would now become a contested space, where the settlers and the indigenous peoples would clash in a fight for survival. The Native American tribes had lived on the plains for generations, their lives intertwined with the land and its rhythms. They understood the plains in ways the settlers could not, its seasons, its movements, its changes. The settlers, however, were determined to carve out their own place in the landscape, and this determination would bring them into conflict with those who had been there long before them. The battles that followed were not just about land, they were about culture, survival, and the collision of two worlds. The plains, once a land of peace and balance, became a land of tension and division. The settlers, who had come in search of a new life, now found themselves at war, not just with nature, but with the indigenous peoples who had once lived in harmony with it. The promises of the plains began to fade as the settlers realized that their dreams of a peaceful life would come at a steep cost. The dangers of the land were not just natural, they were human too. Despite these conflicts, the settlers persevered. Their dreams of land and opportunity were stronger than the forces that sought to break them. They continued to work the soil, plant their crops, and raise their families, even as the land around them seemed to conspire against them. Every year brought new challenges, but it also brought new opportunities. The plains, despite their harshness, were still a land of possibility, a place where dreams could be realized, but only through hard work, perseverance, and resilience. As the settlers built their lives on the plains, they became part of the land itself. The plains were no longer just a backdrop to their struggles, they were the foundation of their existence. The settlers, having fought and struggled against the land and its challenges, now understood it in ways they never had before. They had become a part of the great cycle of the plains, a cycle that had been going on for centuries, a cycle that would continue long after they were gone. The wind still howls across the plains today, just as it did for the settlers who first crossed them. The land remains both beautiful and brutal, both promising and perilous. The plains, once seen as a place to tame, now stand as a testament to the resilience and determination of those who sought to make them their own. And as we move on, the land before us is still alive with the echoes of the past, echoes of those who once called it home, of those who faced the promise and peril of the plains. As the dust settles, we look toward the mountain passes that loom ahead, where new challenges will arise. But for now, the plains lie before us, vast and open, waiting to be embraced. The journey continues, and though the land may be unforgiving, the dream of the West is still alive, still calling to those who are brave enough to answer. Chapter 7. The ghosts of the gold rush, beneath the soil of California, hidden like treasures forgotten by time, lay silver and gold, shiny, alluring, the promise of wealth just beneath the surface. The discovery of gold in the Sierra Nevada foothills in 1848 sent shockwaves through the world, and the ensuing gold rush transformed the American frontier forever. What was once a remote, isolated land became the center of a frantic, feverish explosion of human ambition. For those who flocked to the West, the gold that glittered in their dreams was as powerful as the land itself, pushing them across mountains, rivers and plains in pursuit of fortune, of dreams, and for some, of escape. The gold rush was not merely about digging in the earth for riches, it was about seeking something far deeper, something that had been long denied. For many, it was a chance to escape poverty, to reshape their futures, to be part of something grand, something historic. It wasn't just gold that drove the miners and settlers, it was the hope that with wealth would come respect, power, and identity. The journey to California was as much about reinventing the self as it was about seeking treasure. The landscape of the gold rush was alive with movement, wagons filled with supplies and men ready to stake their claims. Rivers churned with boats and barges, and the hills rang with the sound of picks striking rock and shovels digging into the earth. The air was filled with hope and desperation, optimism and frustration, and the distant hum of dreams colliding with reality. Thousands came, not knowing what they would find, but certain that the reward was worth the risk. They came from all corners of the world, from the east, from foreign lands, from the streets of cities and the quiet corners of rural towns. They came with their hopes tied up in sacks of provisions, with their hearts filled with the belief that fortune could be found in the dirt, in the riverbeds, in the crevices of the earth. The journey to California was not for the faint of heart. The trail was long and arduous, stretching over thousands of miles of difficult terrain. The settlers and miners who made their way westward found themselves crossing deserts, fighting through snowstorms and navigating treacherous mountain passes. Many did not survive the journey. Death lurked on every corner, from the harshness of the elements to the exhaustion brought on by the long days and weeks of travel. Yet, despite these dangers, the rush for gold could not be stopped. It was a fever that gripped the heart and mind, pushing men to travel through perilous conditions, to risk their lives in search of riches and a new future. For those who made it to California, the hardships were far from over. The gold rush was not a glamorous affair, despite its allure in stories and dreams. It was dirty, grueling, and filled with frustration. The miners found themselves panning for gold in freezing streams, digging through rocks with primitive tools and competing with each other for the right to the richest patches of land. The earth was not generous, and those who sought to extract its wealth were often met with disappointment. For every handful of gold dust that gleamed like a star in the pan, there were countless others who left empty-handed, their hopes dashed by the unforgiving land. The rush for gold brought more than just miners, it brought chaos. Towns sprang up almost overnight, shanty towns of tents and makeshift homes where people sought to escape the hardships of their lives back east or in other countries. These towns were wild, lawless, and often violent. Crime rates soared, and violence became a daily occurrence. Lawmen were few, and the settlers who arrived were not always the best of society. Those who came seeking gold also brought with them greed, jealousy, and a sense of entitlement. The settlements became hotbeds of conflict, as tensions boiled over between miners, settlers, and indigenous peoples who had long inhabited the land. While some found gold and were able to fulfill their dreams, for many the gold rush turned out to be an illusion, a promise that was never fully realized. The rivers that once sparkled with gold soon ran dry, and the hills that had once yielded treasure were stripped bare. As the gold became harder to find, the excitement turned into frustration. The settlers, who had hoped to find riches in the land, now found themselves stuck in a place that had promised them everything but given them nothing. The wealth that they had come to find, the reason for their journey, seemed more and more like a distant dream, fading into the harsh reality of life on the frontier. But even as the glitter of gold dulled, something else emerged from the gold rush, something that would have a lasting impact on the West. The gold rush marked the beginning of California's transformation into a state, one that would grow rapidly and become the epicenter of both industry and culture in the United States. The rush for gold was a catalyst that set in motion the development of towns, cities, and industries that would shape the future of the American West. Despite the chaos, the violence, and the inevitable disappointments, the gold rush set the stage for the future, for the building of a new world in the wilderness. The rush for gold also transformed the land itself. The process of mining left scars on the landscape that are still visible today. Mountains were dug into, forests cleared, rivers rerouted, and streams polluted by the waste and chemicals used in the mining process. The dream of striking it rich had led to the destruction of a natural world that had once been pristine and untouched. The gold rush, in its wake, left not just empty promises, but also a landscape forever altered by human hands. The ghosts of the miners, the visionaries, and the hopeful now haunt these hills and valleys. They left their mark in the form of ruins, ghost towns, and memories of a time when the frontier was alive with the fever of possibility. But even as the land bore the marks of the gold rush, the spirit of it lingered. The men and women who came to California in search of gold had come to believe in something larger than themselves. They believed that they could change their fate, that they could seize something greater from the earth. The same spirit that drove them to leave everything behind and journey across a continent would shape the future of the American West, where ambition, greed, and hope collided to create a new world. The gold rush, despite its many failures and tragedies, became a symbol of the frontier itself, a place where dreams were both made and broken, where the land offered both riches and ruin. And so, as we walk through the remnants of the gold rush today, we are walking through the ghosts of the past, echoes of the men and women who came to these hills in search of something more, who staked their claims in the earth, and who left behind a world both marked and moulded by their efforts. The land is no longer filled with the sound of pickaxes and pans, but the traces of that once vibrant chaos still echo in the air. The promise of gold may have faded, but the spirit of the gold rush lives on, hidden in the dust, the soil, and the stories that remain. As the gold grew colder, so too did the landscape, turning into something much darker. Yet even as the rush of the gold rush ebbed away, something else began to rise from its ashes, the realization that the frontier was not just a place of wealth, but of challenge, of transformation, and of a future that was still waiting to be built. Chapter 8. The Battle for the Land. The frontier was never just a land to claim, it was a land to fight for. The great plains, the mountains, the rivers, and the endless forests were all deeply coveted by those who dreamed of settling in the West. But for the indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for centuries, it was home, sacred land, held in reverence for generations. The arrival of settlers in the mid-1800s did not mark the beginning of the battle for the land. It was merely the first chapter in a long and tragic conflict. The story of the American frontier is a story of conquest, survival, and resistance, of a violent collision between two worlds, two ways of life, and two visions of what the land should be. The settlers, lured westward by the promise of fertile soil, gold, and opportunity, did not see the land as others did. To them, the land was to be cultivated, tamed, and owned. It was a place to build new homes, to farm, and to establish an empire that stretched across the continent. In their eyes, the wilderness was something to be conquered. What they didn't see, or perhaps refused to understand, was that the land was already alive with its own history, its own people. The tribes of Native Americans had lived here for generations, moving with the seasons, following the buffalo herds and cultivating their own ways of life. For them, the land was not just a commodity, it was sacred, tied to their spiritual beliefs, their culture, and their ancestors. As the settlers pushed westward, they were met with resistance. The Native American tribes, who had once been isolated from one another, began to unite in the face of a common threat. Their lands were being encroached upon, their homes destroyed, their people driven off their ancestral territories. The settlers had come in search of a new life, but for the Native Americans this was a fight for survival, a struggle to preserve their way of life, their culture, and their connection to the land. In the early days of settlement, many settlers and Native American tribes coexisted, albeit uneasily. The settlers were often dependent on the native peoples for food, trade, and survival in an unfamiliar land. In turn, some tribes were willing to trade and share knowledge with the newcomers, seeing them as potential allies. But as more settlers arrived, the balance began to shift. Tensions mounted, and it became clear that the settlers were not interested in sharing the land. They wanted to possess it, to claim it as their own. The United States government, eager to expand and to fulfill its manifest destiny, supported the settlers' efforts and began to take aggressive steps toward removing the native peoples from their lands. Treaties were signed, but they were often broken or ignored, and promises made to native tribes were frequently reneged upon. The government's goal was to move the indigenous populations onto reservations, isolated from the fertile lands they had once roamed freely. As the settlers spread across the West, the government's policies of forced relocation and land appropriation became more brutal. One of the most tragic chapters of this conflict was the forced relocation of the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and other southeastern tribes in what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Native Americans were marched westward, away from their homelands in the dead of winter, with little food or protection. The journey was brutal. Thousands died from disease, exposure, and exhaustion. Those who survived were placed on barren reservations, far from the lands they had once called home. It was a fate that befell many tribes, and it was only the beginning of the systematic removal and destruction of Native American cultures. But resistance did not fade. In the face of overwhelming odds, Native American leaders such as Tecumseh, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo rose up to challenge the settlers and the US government. They fought not just for land, but for their families, their way of life, and their very existence. These leaders became symbols of defiance, rallying their people against an enemy that outnumbered them, an enemy that had the full force of the US military behind it. The battles were fierce and bloody. The settlers and the Native Americans fought over land, over resources, and over the future. Skirmishes turned into larger conflicts, and wars raged across the frontier, from the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains. The settlers often had the upper hand, armed with superior weaponry, and supported by a government determined to push westward. But the Native Americans had their own weapons: knowledge of the land, expert horsemanship, and a fierce determination to protect their families and their culture. They fought not for conquest, but for survival. One of the most famous of these battles was the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where a combined force of Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, decisively defeated the US Army's 7th Cavalry, commanded by General George Armstrong Custer. It was a rare victory for the Native Americans, a moment of triumph in an otherwise hopeless struggle. But even in their victory, the Native Americans knew the war was not over. The US government would not stop its efforts to remove them from their lands, and the settlers would not stop their push westward. The battle for the land reached its brutal climax with the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, when US soldiers killed over 150 Lakota Sioux men, women, and children in South Dakota. This marked the end of organized resistance to US expansion, but it didn't mark the end of the struggle. The Native Americans were defeated, their lands taken, and their cultures nearly destroyed. But they remained a vital part of the American story. Even as they were pushed to the margins, their spirits endured. The land, which had once been a place of harmony and balance, was now divided. The settlers had claimed their piece of the frontier, but in doing so they had forever altered the fabric of the land. The indigenous peoples who had been so intimately connected to the earth were now displaced and scattered. The land, once shared, had become a battleground, with the echoes of conflict resonating through the earth. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the Native American peoples endured. Their cultures, their traditions, and their stories have lived on, even if their lands have been taken. They have continued to fight for their rights, for recognition, and for the preservation of their way of life. The battle for the land may have been lost, but the spirit of the native peoples lives on, woven into the very soil of the frontier. The battle for the land, however, did not end with the Native American tribes. It continued with the settlers who sought to tame the West, to build cities and industries upon the land that had once been wilderness. The spirit of conquest that drove the settlers to push westward would shape the future of the American frontier for better or worse. And as the land was transformed, so too was the nation that would emerge from the struggle. The frontier was no longer just a place to settle, it was a place to fight, a place to claim, and a place to conquer. As the sun sets on the frontier, We remember the struggles of those who fought for it, the settlers, the soldiers, and the native peoples. And though the battles were fierce and the cost was great, we also remember that the land itself bears witness to the struggles of the past. The land, now transformed by human hands, still holds the echoes of those who fought for it, and it will carry those echoes long after the last battle has been fought. Yet even as the smoke of battle begins to clear, new paths will emerge. Paths not just forged by conflict, but by resilience, hope, and the unyielding spirit of those who seek to make their mark on the land. Chapter 9. The Last Frontier. As the 19th century drew to a close, the frontier, once vast and untouched, began to fade into memory. The signs of progress were everywhere. Railroad tracks cutting through the land like veins of steel, towns rising from the earth like monuments to human ambition, and farms stretching across the plains where only wilderness had once stood. The West, once untamed and wild, was slowly being subdued by the steady march of civilization, a process that was both inevitable and heartbreaking. The dream of the frontier, the promise of a new beginning in the wilderness, was reaching its end, and the land that had once symbolized freedom and possibility was becoming something else entirely. The concept of the frontier had long been a symbol of opportunity, adventure, and discovery. It was a place where the rules of the world did not apply, where anyone, no matter their past, could stake a claim and build a new life. For those who had come west in search of gold, land, or a fresh start, the frontier had been the embodiment of hope. It was a vast expanse full of promise where the future was still unwritten. But as the years passed and as settlers moved ever deeper into the heart of the continent, the frontier began to shrink. The wildness of the land was slowly being replaced by the order of civilization, and the untamed beauty of the West was being reshaped into something more familiar, more predictable, and more human-made. The closing of the frontier, as declared by the US Census Bureau in 1890, marked a turning point in the history of the American West. The once endless stretches of land were no longer frontier in the sense that they had been. They had been mapped, settled, and tamed. The wilderness had been conquered, and with it, much of the spirit of the frontier. For the first time in history, the United States no longer had a frontier, an area that was open and unexplored, where the possibilities for new settlements and discoveries were endless. This realization marked a profound shift in the national consciousness. The frontier, once an essential part of American identity, was gone. Yet, even as the frontier closed, something else emerged, a new way of thinking about what the West had been and what it had come to symbolize. The frontier was no longer a place, but an idea, one that could no longer be defined by the wildness of the land or the hardships of the pioneers. It had become a symbol of the American spirit, of the qualities that define the nation itself: ambition, resilience, and the unyielding drive to overcome adversity. In the wake of the frontier's closing, the question became, what happens when the land is no longer wild? What happens when the frontier is no longer the place where the future is shaped, but the past that must be remembered? The answer lay in the transformation of the land itself. As the settlers built cities, railroads, and farms, they reshaped the very geography of the West. The open spaces that had once been wild and free were now dotted with towns and villages, each one a reflection of the civilization that was replacing the untamed wilderness. The fertile fields of the Great Plains were turned into productive farmland, the mountain passes and valleys into mining towns and railroad hubs. The promise of the frontier, once so simple and pure, had become complicated by industry, politics, and progress. The settlers had not just changed the land, they had transformed its very meaning. But even as the frontier closed and the landscape changed, the spirit of the West endured. The idea of the frontier, the desire to go beyond what was known, to seek adventure and opportunity in the unknown, remained alive in the hearts of those who had lived through it. It was no longer a physical space to be conquered, but a state of mind, a symbol of the drive to push forward, to never stop seeking, to never stop exploring. The frontier may have been closed, but its spirit lived on in the people who had come to the West in search of something greater than themselves. In the final years of the 19th century, as the West was being tamed, the challenges of life in the frontier continued to haunt those who had lived through it. Many settlers found that the promises of the land did not always live up to their expectations. The farming communities that had sprung up on the plains often faced droughts and crop failures, and the railroads, which had once seemed like the answer to the isolation of the West, brought new problems of their own. The once idyllic vision of the frontier as a place of endless opportunity began to fade as the harsh realities of life in the West set in. The myth of the frontier was not entirely gone, but it had become tangled with the truths of the settlers' struggles. Yet even as these difficulties persisted, a sense of nostalgia began to take hold. The frontier, with all its promise and peril, became a symbol of what America had once been, a land of freedom, exploration, and possibility. The spirit of the frontier was no longer confined to the physical land, but had become an ideal that could be looked back upon with longing and reverence. Writers, artists, and filmmakers began to romanticize the West, turning it into a mythic place where the ideals of rugged individualism, courage, and self-reliance still thrived. The closing of the frontier did not mark the end of the West. It marked a shift in the way the West was perceived. No longer was it the untamed wilderness, but a symbol of America's past, a place where the country had been forged, where the nation had defined itself through struggle and perseverance. The frontier was now something to be remembered, a place that had shaped the American spirit and in doing so had helped shape the country itself. In the years that followed, the West would continue to evolve. The land that had once seemed like a blank slate, waiting to be written upon, would be filled with the complexities of modern life. Cities would grow, industries would rise, and the landscape would change once again, this time in the name of progress. But the spirit of the frontier, the desire to push boundaries, to seek out new opportunities, to forge a new future, remained at the heart of America's identity. The closing of the frontier was not just the end of a chapter in history, it was the beginning of a new one. The land had been conquered, but the idea of the frontier, the quest for something beyond the known, would continue to shape America's future. The last frontier had closed, but the drive to explore, to seek, to build, and to dream would never truly end. The frontier, once a place to be discovered, would become a place to be remembered, a symbol of the indomitable American spirit, forever alive in the hearts of those who look to the horizon, waiting for the next journey to begin. Chapter 10. The Unwritten Roads Ahead. Though the frontier was closed, its influence never truly dissipated. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the American West had undergone a profound transformation. The once untamed wilderness, where explorers, settlers, and indigenous peoples had contended for land, had been conquered by the forces of expansion, industry, and civilization. Railroads had stretched their steel tendrils across the land, cities rose from the dust, and farming communities had taken root in the soil that had once been wild. Yet, even as the frontier had closed, the spirit of the West, the bold, unyielding drive to push ever forward, remained, reverberating through the heart of America. The frontier, in all its raw, untamed glory, had been a place where people sought to create something new. It was a space of infinite possibilities, where the land offered both freedom and hardship, where the future could be written in the dirt and dust. But as the years passed, the vast expanse of the West had shrunk. The wilderness was tamed, the land claimed, and a new way of life emerged, one defined by cities, industries, and the quiet hum of modernity. Yet, the closing of the frontier did not mark the end of exploration. It marked the beginning of a new kind of journey. The spirit of the West had not been extinguished. It had simply evolved. The end of the frontier did not mean that the American people had lost their desire for adventure, for expansion, or for the next frontier to conquer. What had been a physical boundary had now become a metaphorical one. The uncharted territories of the West had been replaced by new challenges, both at home and abroad, that would shape the future of the nation. The frontier had given rise to a national identity rooted in exploration, risk, and reinvention. But that identity would no longer be defined by the land. Instead, it would shift toward innovation, invention, and the never-ending drive to push beyond the limits of what was known. As the 20th century dawned, the American frontier was no longer a place but an idea. The pioneers of the past had sought to claim the land, to carve out a life in the wilderness, but their descendants now sought to claim something far different, their place in a rapidly changing world. The new frontier was not one of mountains or plains, but of technology, industry, and culture. The roads that had once been carved through rugged terrain were now highways to a modern future, stretching beyond the horizon and leading into uncharted waters. The frontier was no longer a distant place. It was everywhere, in every innovation, every new endeavour, every moment of progress that pushed the country forward. Yet, even as the land was settled and its boundaries defined, the frontier still held sway over the American imagination. The story of the West, the tale of men and women who had braved the unknown and fought for a future in the wilderness, remained a central part of the national narrative. It was a story of overcoming adversity, of believing that anything was possible, of carving out a new world in a place that had once seemed hostile. The myths and legends of the frontier continued to shape the nation's identity, even as the reality of the land itself was absorbed into the ever-expanding fabric of civilization. For the generations that followed, the idea of the frontier, the desire to explore, to seek, to conquer, would manifest in new ways. The frontier of the early settlers had been a place of rugged individualism, where each person was responsible for their own survival and success. But as the 20th century progressed, the new frontier would be defined by collective effort and shared knowledge. The pioneers of the future would not be plodding along dusty trails with ox-drawn wagons, but rather charging forward in the world of technology, science, and industry. Their vehicles of progress powered not by steam, but by electricity. Not by muscle, but by intellect. The idea of progress that had driven the settlers to stake their claims in the West now extended into the realm of innovation. New frontiers were being charted, not on the ground, but in the skies. Aviation, space exploration, and the technological revolution of the 20th century created new spaces to be conquered. Frontiers of the mind, of invention, and of human ingenuity. The same drive that had led men and women to cross rivers and climb mountains was now being channeled into the exploration of new worlds, both physical and intellectual. The closing of the frontier did not extinguish the American spirit of exploration. It simply redirected it. As the land became increasingly developed and settled, the focus shifted to the world of ideas, the pursuit of scientific knowledge, and the discovery of new realms in space and technology. The spirit of the frontier, the desire to push beyond the known, now lived in the fields of science and innovation. The unknown was no longer a wilderness, but a frontier of the mind, a place where the possibilities for the future were limited only by imagination and ambition. Even as technology and progress reshaped the nation, the land that had once been the epicenter of the American frontier retained its hold on the national consciousness. The West, with its vast open spaces, its rugged beauty, and its history of triumph and tragedy, remained a symbol of what America had once been and what it had the potential to become. The mountains, rivers, and plains, once the battlegrounds for survival, now became the backdrop for a new kind of exploration, one that sought not to conquer the land, but to understand its history, its meaning, and its place in the story of the nation. In the decades that followed, the land itself would continue to shape the lives of those who lived on it. The cities that had sprung up in the wake of the settlers would grow, their skylines reaching higher, their industries expanding, and their economies shifting toward the future. The frontier, once a place of settlement, would become a place of preservation, as national parks and protected lands were created to ensure that the spirit of the West would not be forgotten. The land, which had once been so relentlessly claimed and reshaped, would now be preserved as a testament to the past, a reminder of the sacrifices, the dreams, and the struggles of those who had built America from the wilderness. Yet even as the frontier faded into history, its influence could still be felt in the hearts of those who carried its legacy forward. The drive to explore, to innovate, to push beyond the limits of what was known remained at the core of the American spirit. The frontier had been closed, but its lessons lived on. The idea of the frontier, of seeking the unknown and shaping the future, had been passed down from generation to generation, and as long as there were roads to travel, questions to answer, and horizons to reach, the frontier would never truly be gone. The written history of the frontier may have ended, but the unwritten roads ahead stretch into the future, inviting the next generation to dream, to discover, and to push the boundaries of what we know. The spirit of the frontier, the desire to journey into the unknown, remains a vital force, guiding us toward new frontiers that are yet to be explored. As the last light of the day fades behind the mountains and the stars begin to twinkle in the vast sky above, we come to the end of our journey through the American frontier. The land, once wild and untamed, has been shaped, moulded, and transformed by the dreams, struggles, and sacrifices of countless souls who walked its endless stretches. The frontier, as we knew it, is gone. Its boundaries no longer defined by mountains or rivers, but by the forces of industry, progress, and human ambition. Yet, as we leave behind the era of the frontier, we are reminded that its spirit remains, etched into the very soil beneath our feet, woven into the heart of the nation, and still alive in the hearts of those who dare to seek beyond the known. The frontier was never just a place, it was a journey of discovery, of creation, and of survival. It was a place where men and women sought to carve a new life out of the wild, where the land itself seemed to whisper promises of possibility, and where every step forward was both a triumph and a challenge. But as the frontier closed, its influence did not vanish. Instead, it took on a new form, an idea, a spirit that lives on in the story of America. The West may no longer be a place for settlers to stake their claims, but the desire to push beyond the known, to seek adventure, to forge new paths, and to reinvent ourselves continues to define the American identity. The legacy of the frontier is not just in the cities that grew up from the dust or the railroads that stretched across the land. It is in the spirit of those who faced the unknown with courage, who believed that anything was possible, who saw not just what was, but what could be. It lives in the hearts of explorers, innovators, dreamers, and pioneers who carry that same restless desire to find new horizons and to push the boundaries of human achievement. And so, as we bid farewell to the frontier, we carry with us the lessons it has taught us, the resilience to face hardship, the courage to embrace uncertainty, and the unyielding belief that the future is ours to shape. The land that once called to those who sought a new life is now a part of us all, its stories woven into the very fabric of the nation. As the echoes of the past fade into the stillness of the night, we remember that the frontier may be gone, but its spirit lives on, silent, steady, and eternal. For in the heart of every journey, in the pursuit of every dream, and in the quiet moments of reflection, the frontier is still here, still waiting to be discovered, still calling us forward, step by step. And as the world sleeps, the memory of the frontier endures, a whisper carried on the wind, guiding the next generation toward the unwritten roads that lie ahead. Good night.